Well, first of all, I'd like to welcome everyone to our educational session here called Building Security In, right? Intelligent security design, development, acquisition, and so forth. So I thought I'd share with you some best practices around that, and hope everybody leaves the presentation today with a good understanding of cybersecurity best practices and so forth. My name is Steve Caimi. I work with Cisco, and I focus on U.S. public sector problems and challenges, right, from the federal government to the DoD, state and local, and so forth. And I worked with the government for about 10 years or so in various different types of roles. And just a little bit about me. I've been doing cybersecurity for about 20 years. I started back in 1995 working for Citicorp when we were actually plugging the network into the internet and doing online banking and things like that, and various technical and product management roles over the years, covering all kinds of different things from network forensics to identity and access management and so forth. So just a little bit there about me. I thought I'd kick things off. The topic is about building security in, and the federal CIO spoke to NIST at the Cloud Computing Workshop back in July, I think it was, and he actually flashed this screen up, and he goes, "Building security in is a bit like duct taping airbags to a 1965 Mustang," right? Picture what that would look like, right? And I think all of us know security should be built in from the beginning. But, and so it's fantastic when you have things like, CalCloud, right? You have a new infrastructure that's being built up, and you can think about today's security, right, as you're building up, something new. But in so many ways, we have inherited a lot of systems that are out there, right? We have inherited a lot of people and process and so forth. So a lot of times we're stuck doing this. And, I'd like to share with you some insight about how we can address, these kinds of things. I had to put this out here too. I live in the DC area, and the Brookings Institute is a DC area think tank. And recently they had an article about some of the states with some of the best cybersecurity plans. And I have to put out here, state of California, first of all, they have out here acknowledging of the cybersecurity problem. I would certainly say California does a fabulous job of that, right? Implementing strategic cybersecurity plans. Certainly we've seen that as well. Acting on the cybersecurity metrics and so forth. But one thing I would put out here, and it's yellow, and a lot of you might question why I put it there, but relying on NIST standards rather than locally developed plans is one of the characteristics they put out there for state agencies. And I think a lot of us already know that the California Information Security Office, right, and this is something that I learned within the past 6 months, is about the State Administrative Manual, how extensive it is, right? It already aligns with NIST Special Publication 853, with the Federal Information Processing Standards and so forth. But as I looked through this, I realized that, wait a minute, this is first of all, it's a locally developed plan, right? It's the state of California. There's 77 pages, right? There's 40 different sections. And I was trying to picture, as a new cybersecurity person working for the state of California, how long it might take for me to learn this manual and understand what it's actually telling me. The other thing I realized that I think it's updated every 3 years or perhaps more frequently, but it's somebody in the CSO's office painstakingly mapped this to NIST Special Publication 853, which I think most of us know are the minimum security controls for federal information standards, kind of the Bible, especially for things like FISMA compliance. But then you turn to that document and you realize that that is huge, right? There's a lot to put out there. If anyone in this room has ever read NIST Special Publication 853 from cover to cover, I think you walk away with the idea that cybersecurity can be completely overwhelming, right? And if you read this document and hand it to somebody, I think they would mostly tend to agree. Plus it's updated, right? We're now on its 4th revision. So I'm trying to map the State Administrative Manual back to the new revision of NIST Special Publication 853 and so forth. And I know no one in here works for the DoD, but I had a chance to speak with them, I guess about a week ago or so. And I think maybe a lot of you know that they're moving away from their DIACAP program and now starting to adopt the NIST risk management framework. So the DoD itself is trying to move towards NIST standards, but they've recognized the challenge, right? The risk management framework incorporates a lot of those different documents. It's a pretty heavy process, pretty complicated to understand. And so we're left with, wow, there's a lot of locally developed plans. There's a lot, almost potentially too much, cybersecurity guidance out there. How do we manage cybersecurity risk against, all this backdrop? And so, I don't know, maybe I should put out there, maybe there's a better way, but there's certainly a different way out there. And I would like to educate everyone, if you're not already familiar with it, is a framework that's meant to do what our topic here, describes us to, for us to do. First of all, intelligent security design, right? If we can't design the security directly into something that's brand new, then certainly we want to bake it into our processes, right? We want to bake it into our improvement, processes and so forth. We want to continue to develop, right? So as we develop our cybersecurity, we want to include it in our existing risk management, programs and so forth. We want to be able to use it as a way to communicate cybersecurity, right? So if we all use the same language when we talk about cybersecurity, whether it's with our vendors, right, with partners and so forth. And finally, how to acquire cybersecurity solutions, products, and services intelligently. How do we do it on a risk-based approach, right? How do we do it in the context of what's so important for potentially your state agency and focus on just the things that are the most important and the most impactful now, right, to improve the cybersecurity stance? So I'll throw out there that it's here, right? NIST has put forth some guidance that I think is pretty incredible because it's probably the first document that I've ever read from NIST that I understood completely in the first read. It's called the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. It's been out for about 2 years now. And actually some other states are starting to align their policies against the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. And I thought I'd share with you just a high-level view of the framework and how it works. All right, so if I gave you just a little bit of background on the framework, I think you'll see a little bit about how it's different from what we might have seen before. First of all, I also point out that the NASIO's top 10 priorities always talk about things like security, how important it is, right, and how we want to do a better job of doing risk assessments and governance and security frameworks and so forth. And I think all this aligns, right? So probably everybody in this room already knows that the National Institute of Standards and Technology, part of the US Department of Commerce, right? There's a lot of other things that they do beyond information technology. But when I think of NIST, or at least initially, I always think of the Computer Security Resource Center, right? That's the place where you turn for the Computer 800 series special publications, the FIPS publications, the Federal Information Processing Standards and so forth, right? All of us know that that's where the CSRC is. But a lot of people don't realize there's a lot of other programs that NIST does related to information technology. One of them, like I mentioned, is the Cybersecurity Framework, which is the thrust of the conversation here today. But even other things, like there's a program going on called the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, NSTIC for short. And that's about how to deal with the problem of usernames and passwords. We all know the challenges and breaches that can occur with weak authentication and so forth. So NIST has a lot of different publications that they do from that perspective. Okay, back to, say, February of 2013, many of you probably already know too that the president signed an executive order for improving critical infrastructure cybersecurity, right? Recognizing that we're connecting more things, right? The push towards the Internet of Things, we're connecting industrial control systems, right? Things that in a lot of ways didn't have security built in. A lot of these systems were designed to work either in obscurity or into systems that were air-gapped, right? Things that are just not well understood, certainly not running over IP and so forth. But a lot of that, as we know, has changed in in recent years. So as an output of that executive order, NIST was directed to come up with a cybersecurity framework initially for critical infrastructure that helped accomplish some of these goals. Right? First of them is how to manage cybersecurity risks, but do it in a cost-effective way. Another one is to not reinvent wheels. So why don't we go and reference existing best practices, like not only Special Publication 853, but also things like the Council on Cybersecurity, the SANS Top 20 critical security controls, and so forth. Also, potentially a framework that could work internationally. Right? Critical infrastructure spans well beyond the United States. So what if we could put together a framework that could be adopted by governments and organizations all around the globe? And then I think perhaps one of the most important points, and you might hear me say it a few times today, is a way to talk and think about cybersecurity risk in the same way, right? In the same construct, so that we can all have that effective security conversation. I think the other thing we want to point out here is that the framework covers all three. I think, obviously technology can't solve every problem that's out there. There's always, people and process associated with it, and the framework really recognizes that. And when you take a look through the framework, things like incident response planning, awareness and training, and so forth, we realize how important the impact on people and process, right, and good cybersecurity hygiene and things like that have on cybersecurity best practices. I have a picture up here with a bunch of empty chairs, and the reason why I have all these empty chairs is because it's all the cybersecurity professionals that we need in our state agencies and, frankly, all around the world that we don't have. Right? We all know that there's a severe shortage of cybersecurity skills out there. That's why we have all kinds of initiatives, like NIST has the national initiative for cyberspace education to train the workforce of tomorrow and so forth, but these things will take time. So if we can help organizations of any size, state agencies, local governments, healthcare providers, optimize what they're actually doing, their cybersecurity activities, right, to focus on the things that are the most impactful, we can make the best of the people who actually are in those chairs, right? And that's one key aspect of the framework, is to be able to guide organizations towards those things, those cybersecurity activities that are indeed the most impactful. Secondly, like I said, you'll hear me mention this a few times, is about facilitating cybersecurity conversations, but do it so that we're talking apples to apples, right? If I go into a chief information security officer and start talking about the NetFlow project that I need, I'm probably going to lose them at the word NetFlow, right? So we have to be able to talk in a way that all of us can understand, not just within an organization, but potentially too with our partners, with our vendors, right? We in the vendor community could do a far better job of helping you if we all talk in the same language, right? So we obviously want to be able to facilitate those conversations. Another thing that's really important, and I think is one of the bigger myths, is that the cybersecurity framework is another standard or it's something else that we need to follow, and it's not intended to be at all, right? What it is a framework for cybersecurity that, first of all, is that puzzle piece that lets you slot cybersecurity into whatever you're already doing for risk management, right? Organizations have, either they're following the actual risk management framework from NIST or whatever else, they tend to want it to work with. The framework is designed to slot right in, right? It's not meant to replace anything, and certainly it's not a new compliance standard, for example. Another thing they point out is that there's no specifics about technology. Like, they're not actually telling you which technologies you need to use, and for a lot of reasons, right? The cybersecurity challenge changes, technology changes, so they focus on the activities, right? What are those high-value activities that have been proven, most effective in the world today, right? By working with both, public and private sector, and putting those things out there as a place to start. When I spoke with the DoD, as they were struggling with adopting the risk management framework, they mentioned about how important it is to find those security controls that, the analogy was that keep the plane in the sky, right? If you're flying a fighter jet, like the missile control system, for example, isn't essential for keeping the plane in the sky. And I think a lot of the NIST cybersecurity framework is a lot like those controls that keep that plane flying, right? The things you absolutely need to do. Applies to everyone. This is another thing that's probably a big myth in terms of the name itself. It's the NIST Cybersecurity Framework for critical infrastructure protection, but it's not just for that. And what we've seen over the course of the past 2 years, that organizations of really any size and shape, and I've done this presentation for a wide variety of different audiences, including healthcare, higher ed, and so forth, right? Beyond the traditional concept of critical infrastructure. So it applies to really any organization facing any level of cybersecurity risk, right? No matter how advanced they are or not, right? So let me give you just a little bit of the framework basics. This isn't meant to be an exhaustive discussion about the cybersecurity framework, but I think if all of us leave with just an understanding of what it's about, right, and how it's meant to be used. I think the most important point that I want you to leave with is that it's not just a regurgitation of things like NIST 853 with just a whole pile of stuff to do, right? It's meant to put a process around it in order to figure out the things that are the most important for your agency or your organization. The first aspect is what's called the framework core, and those are those sets of controls that are working particularly effectively in the world today, right? They're organized in a way that I'll introduce you to in a little bit, and then has informative resources, or those links to all the best practice documents, right, that help you figure out where to take those next steps, right? Secondly is what's called an implementation tier, or really, if you take a look at the framework core and you look at how well you're doing in each of those different areas, NIST has put forth a set of tiers from tier 1 to tier 4 to give you just a guide, right, for how you might choose to maybe rank yourself, right, how well you're doing in each of those different control areas. Tier 1 could be completely informal. Maybe we have an Excel spreadsheet that we use to track our systems and so forth, right? Maybe it's not ingrained in the organizational process or automated, right? Whereas tier 4 might be fully established as an organizational process. Maybe there's some automation, maybe there's some technology behind it, and anywhere in between. And then finally, once we've had a chance to take a look at that core and take a look at how well we're doing in those areas, we have to build out that roadmap. So the concept is called a profile. We can build a current profile, given an assessment of the core against how well we're doing today. And then we make a risk-based decision on where we want to be in the future, right? It could be one or more target profiles, right, that help you guide your activities, right? Focus on those areas that are the most impactful. As we take a look at the core, right, just the core itself, it's broken up into the 4 areas, right? It's a table aligned to functions, categories, subcategories, and informative resources. The functions are those high-level goals, right, of cybersecurity, and that the framework core also is what we're talking about in terms of having that consistent vernacular or the same language that we're using to describe cybersecurity. Under the functions, those are split out into categories, right? Those are the different activities related to a given high-level goal. Then subcategories, right, that break those out a little bit more. And then finally, informative resources are the links back to those best practices, right? So you can gotta get a picture in your head of what the framework core looks like. Let's hone in on just the functions for a second, and you can see that there's those abbreviations like ID and PR. Like those are put in place so that we can all talk about cybersecurity, use the same abbreviations and things like that. When I talk about the NetFlow project, I'm probably gonna start by talking about the detect phase, right? I'm not gonna start out by talking about my NetFlow project. I'm gonna talk about we need to do a better job of detection and doing it in a way that uses the information that's readily available on the network, right? So you can use the cybersecurity framework to have that conversation. You can see that it's broken out into 5 very simple places, right? Identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, right? Those are those high-level goals. I think all of us know that we need to be able to identify what we have all the way to the point to be able to recover from a potential cybersecurity breach. And then if we hone in on just some of the specifics, right? I won't show the entire framework as an exhaustive thing, but I thought I would rip the bottom off the framework there and just give a sense of what it looks like when you look at the identify phase, for example, and then start looking at those high-level categories, things like asset management or governance, right? That's where we start getting into those specifics. And then we can take a category like asset management and break those things out into the specific things that we need to do in order to accomplish those goals, right? So I think you can kind of see how that's coming together, right? Those functions get you to the point where we can actually see that what we need to do in terms of asset management is know what physical devices are connecting to our networks, right? How many of us know everything is connecting to our network, right? I mean, how many of us know that there's 2,500 iPads that have connected in the past week, for example? Or perhaps more importantly, the second one is about software platforms. You know, how many of us know where malware is, right? That's the ultimate in unauthorized software, in my opinion, right? But even things like web applications, a lot of us don't even know what web applications have been deployed, you know, what's changed, right? What are the configurations on these things? So I think you can kind of see, right? It puts those best practice guidelines and helps you guide you to the things that are the most specific, right? The things that you really should focus on. If I look at just one, right now I want to show you the informative resources, the links for the identify phase, asset management, and looking for physical devices. You can see that it links back to all the informative resources are really, you know, those best practices that have already been, you know, put in place. Again, we're not reinventing the wheel here. What we're doing is aligning those. So for example, I might point to the Council on Cybersecurity's critical security control #1, right? That's where you can get that additional information for how to accomplish that specific goal if you've chosen that to be the area of focus, right? I think I mentioned to you about tiers, right? This is a suggestion from NIST of how to approach it. Certainly, you can choose to use whatever, you know, way that you want to do about how well you're doing in each of those different control areas, right? And then the aspect of profiles helps you build out that roadmap. So we assess how well we are doing, you know, against the framework core today. Then we can build one or more profiles out for where to focus our activities, right? So that's the purpose of the framework profile, you know, piece. If we take a look at just the entire framework, right? I know that that's a hard slide to see, but the identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, these are all the high-level categories. So it gets into things like asset management, to access control, and awareness and training, incident response planning. We all know how important that is to do before an actual breach occurs. Security continuous monitoring, so forth. Those are all the high-level goals. And I think you can kind of see that the point is to help us understand what we have all the way down to the point where we can restore operations and not let a breach go undetected for 224 days. Right? We have to be able to spot that stuff quickly so that we can take action. I mentioned to you earlier, though, that when you actually look through the framework, right, we have people, process, and technology. Where I have those colors areas, you can see that, you know, people and process, that means that people and process apply to everything across the board. Only about half of those framework controls can really be satisfactorily addressed with technology. Right? Yeah, access control, for example. That's one aspect that, you know, you can put a technology solution in place to help you manage. But certainly people and process still, you know, factor into all that. So I thought that's important, right? How I think We all know this, but I think it's worth pointing out how important people and processes to to cybersecurity. That's just a very quick view of the cybersecurity framework, but I think what's more important here is how to use it. How do we take this type of guidance, right? The risk management framework, if you tried to open up all those individual NIST standards and try to figure out where to get started, that seems to be the hardest part. Or maybe not even just getting started, how to improve the cybersecurity program based on a huge, heavy process like that. So NIST puts forth a number of different ways that the framework can be used from, on the left-hand side, just a basic review of cybersecurity activities. Maybe all we do is take a look at it, right, and we compare it to what we're doing today. But a lot of organizations in the second aspect is probably more about improving an existing cybersecurity program, all right? And so that's where I thought we would focus. And without going through a ton of detail on the process, the framework gives a guidance towards how to approach that. And I've alluded to it a little bit here. It's about trying to figure out, priorities, right? What's most important from a business or a mission, perspective, to the point where we can understand what threats and vulnerabilities are faced, to actually creating that current profile, mapping it against our target profile, and then taking the appropriate action. So I won't go through a ton of detail on each of these. You can see on the slides here, but it gives additional guidance on each of those different steps, right? So as we go through and we prioritize, we need to figure out what our strategic objectives are. We need to know what's most important for our agency. Once we get to that point, we have to understand what kind of systems and the threats that they face, right? Is this system connected to the internet? Or what happens if malware infects this system over here? What are those kinds of threats? And where are the vulnerabilities to the systems? I mentioned to you the current profile, and NIST is actually pretty clear about not putting a template together on a current profile. They actually want to make sure that you can take this and slot it into your existing risk management program. But I thought it was instructive just to kind of take the table and maybe give a sense for what it might look like. So you can see that this is the framework core again, and I'm looking at the identify function, asset management, and some of the top subcategories, certainly not all of them, and certainly not the entire framework. But if I go through and do that assessment, maybe we realize that we're only tier 1 in terms of the physical device management. Maybe we're only tier 1. It's really informal. Maybe we have an Excel spreadsheet. Maybe we don't even know who the system owner is, right? So we would rank ourselves, say, as a tier 1 there. And we could continue through the framework. Maybe some of it's not used. Maybe there's some controls that should be there that aren't. We can certainly add them in, right? The framework is meant to be adaptable like that. Then you conduct that risk assessment. So when you take a look at where you are, right, for your organization or your agency, that's where you make that risk-based decision. What's acceptable and what isn't, right? Risk is all about trying to make effective decisions, right? You can't eliminate risk. I don't know of a single way to eliminate risk, but to bring it down to an acceptable level. We might determine that for a specific organization that those first two being tier 1, that's what puts us at an unacceptably high risk. Yeah, in a perfect world, we'd be tier 4 across the board, but those areas, maybe those are the areas where our specific agency really needs to focus. And so we build that target profile or that future profile, that roadmap, of where we want to be, right? And we can actually point out those things, and that's where it helps us hone in on those specific activities that'll drive the most value in the organization. This, in my opinion, is the power of the framework, right? It's not throwing a litany of controls at you, and here's a 77-page, SAM, right? It's a way to actually tear it apart and to build that into the risk management program and focus on those specific areas. Obviously, the next step is analyzing the gaps between where you are and where you want to be, and then you look towards the informative resources to help you build that action plan out, right? So it's not enough to just get to a point where we go, okay, yeah, we need to do asset management better. We need to know where to go. So maybe we need to turn to NIST Special Publication 853, but we don't want to turn to all 460 pages. We need to know which specific control area, CM8, which is the one that actually helps us accomplish that, right? And we could have chosen, the other best practices that, that NIST has put out there. So I don't know. When I think of it in terms of, Cisco, if I'm trying to develop my action plan and I need to figure out an accurate, device inventory, maybe it is technology that can help, right? We need to know what's connecting. We need to have something that has insight into what mobile devices are connecting, what identities are behind them, and so forth. So without making it a Cisco commercial, it could actually lead us toward a Cisco, I shouldn't say a Cisco, a cybersecurity solution that helps us accomplish that goal. So for example, Cisco Identity Services Engine does just that, right? It helps us understand what's being connected to the network, connects it back to identities, and so forth. And it's not, no one would put it out there as an inventory management system, but it's the first step towards helping to identify what's actually out there. I think it was said earlier this week that you can't protect what you don't know that you have, right? So you absolutely need to know what you have in order to protect it. The other aspect is obviously continuous improvement. You probably saw that I built out one profile, but once we've accomplished this, maybe it's a year later, maybe it's longer, right? But we know that we need to go back through this process and do a continuous improvement, and that's what the process puts it towards. And a couple of quick slides. I wanted to share with you how we think a little bit about cybersecurity at Cisco. A lot of times we even think in terms of threes. Human beings tend to think in terms of threes, and even 5 it can be sometimes a bit much. We look at it in terms of a threat-centric model or the right controls that are necessary before an attack, during an attack, and after an attack. Even NIST uses the terminology of an attack continuum. But if you think about it, especially me, 20 years ago working for Citicorp, we spent so much time in the before phase. We wanted to try to prevent everything from occurring. We tried to put firewalls and IDSs and so forth. But I think we've all seen that we need to do a better job in the during phase, right? Detect, block, defend. We can read the Verizon data breach report. We can read Cisco's security report, right? Where we actually show how long it takes for time to detection. Like the mean time to detection these days is measured in months. And a lot of times the agency or the organization doesn't even discover it themselves. A partner comes in and finds it. That's pretty terrifying, right? We can't let that stuff go undetected for that long. And then perhaps just as importantly is we need to have those capabilities after the fact to be able to scope how far did the breach go, for example. We have to be able to contain it once we know how far it's went. And then we need to have those capabilities to remediate and restore operations, right? And that has to span across everything, whether it's just the network or the endpoint, where my head was back 20 years ago at Citicorp, to where we are today with mobile devices, right? I take a mobile device and walk into a Cisco network that was just on public Wi-Fi. What kind of malware am I about to propagate, through the organization, right? So we have to have that concept across the entire, new attack continuum, considering, cloud applications, SaaS applications, and so forth. And it has to be done now, right? We have to do a point in time. We have to use the best information we have available today. But we also have to do it on a continuous basis because I think all of us know that today's threats are nothing like they were 20 years ago, not even 10 years ago. We have advanced malware now that comes in different pieces. It reassembles itself. There's malware out there that actually knows that it's in a sandbox and being analyzed and will lie dormant. It uses different types of technologies to pull itself together. It's incredibly hard to have all the information when this file comes down. 2 months later, another file comes down, right? It's incredibly difficult to know that those 2 individual pieces, and it's usually more than 2, will actually become a piece of malware at some point and assemble itself. We have to have the capabilities to understand that kind of stuff, and that's the way we think about cybersecurity. I think it's pretty clear, right? It kind of aligns with the framework core. So when we think of before, during, and after, the before phase is all about the framework cores identify and protect, right? A lot of times when we're talking, we say you can't protect what you don't know that you have, and like I said, I think it was even mentioned here at the conference, but knowing what you have before the attack, we have to continue doing that, absolutely. No one's saying you can't abandon your before phase type stuff. But clearly the detect, respond, and recover is where we have to have a complete approach to cybersecurity. And I think when we look at things like Cisco's security strategy and how it's rooted in things like best practices, I would like for you to just kind of keep that in mind, right? This is the way we think about security, and we actually listen very closely to all best practices, whether it's from NIST or whatever. Just 2 slides more on this. I thought I'd share with you just a quick view of how our various security products align with the specific capabilities. So when I tore apart the cybersecurity framework, I mapped it against the capabilities that our solutions have. And where technology applies, right? The Cisco security products. We talked about how only about half of the framework is actually covered by technology. But we have technology that, from, I mentioned Identity Services Engine, to even being able to control what data is going up to the cloud. Right? We even have solutions to help, to be able to do that. So where the technology actually fits, you can see where in the specific control areas that each of our different products, align. Security services are just as important, right? Because anything like this, even the simplified, cybersecurity framework, you could probably use some help, right? So an organization like ours with things like advisory services to help, figure out the assessment, to be able to do the integration to optimize whatever solutions, right, we're actually working with, to managing them, whether they're Cisco solutions or not, right? Managed solutions are obviously a big way a lot of organizations are helping to overcome the talent shortage, that we have. There's just not enough people, obviously, to do, all of that stuff. So I thought I'd just share with you, a little bit of information about that. As we draw to a conclusion, I just, wanted to build security back in, and if we actually do build security in, what does it look like, right? Now, Tony Scott didn't show this slide, but I had to show it partly because I love cars, but doesn't that look fantastic now? Security built right into the airbags are no longer duct taped, right? But I think we can all see that the NIST Cybersecurity Framework helps us enable those goals of building security in, whether it's from a new program to improving an existing program, to helping align all of our activities so that we can design that into our day-to-day activities. We can continue to develop and improve, right? And then we can acquire the right stuff, right? Whether it's a technology solution or a combination of a services type solution and so forth. We have to be able to know where to focus, and we have to do it on a risk basis for each of us. We have to make that decision on our own, right, for each agency. So what's next? I thought I'd just share with you, NIST is doing more, right? They're considering, like always, another revision of things, right? They gather more feedback, right? No document like this is ever meant to be, said and done. So they actually put out there that the framework is a living document and is meant to be continually improved upon. So they're obviously continuing to do that. This is something, and I agree, that aligning the NIST cybersecurity framework a little bit better with the overall risk management framework is a key aspect of what they're trying to do. If you tear apart the risk management framework, you get to phases where it's about selecting controls and implementing, right? That's kind of where, in my opinion, is kind of where the framework sort of lets off, right? It doesn't get into the authorization to operate and stuff like that. So I feel like doing a better alignment there could help tremendously for any organization. They're also doing more about better improving identity, right? I think identity is a key aspect in cybersecurity, and especially in the risk management framework that could be improved upon, right? So they're doing more pilots with that NSTIC, or the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, and I think they're going to take more of their learnings about how important identity is, right? Knowing who's behind which device, being able to set policy, right? So if I go into a Cisco office with my Android device, Cisco knows that it's Steve, right? And I'm on my mobile device, and then the network enforces where I'm allowed to go based upon my identity and what device I'm actually using that type of context, right? So I think those NSTIC pilots and additional guidance about identity awareness and authentication, things like that will probably be probably very well received. They're also continuing to push on this sharing of threat information. I think there's even a bill that's being proposed for doing a better job of just sharing threat information. I know DHS, they gather a lot of classified threat information. We at Cisco, we have a group called Talos. That's our threat research team, right? It's built from the old SourceFire vulnerability research team and all the legacy Cisco folks. These guys are brilliant. I actually wish they were here and did a presentation about all the intelligence that they bake into the solutions. But we gather a lot of threat information as well, and we need to do a better job of sharing that information, right, so that all of us can benefit from the threat information. So Cisco participates with ISAC, so we work with the National Health, we work with the FS-ISAC, the multi-state ISAC, and so forth. But just doing a better job of automating that information, sharing it within real time, right? So that's some of what's coming next. And then, like I said, working more about developing the cybersecurity of the future. So the NIST, or the National Initiative for Cyberspace Education. Let's get kids excited about this stuff. Let's get them playing with it. Let's get them learning more about technology and stuff like that. More than just playing with their phones. I've got to teach them how this stuff works and get them excited into really becoming our cybersecurity workforce in the future. I don't think any of us thinks that this is going away anytime soon. There was an article in the DC area recently that said 0% unemployment in cybersecurity in the Washington, DC area where I live. I mean, 0%, right? That's probably everywhere, but I just thought I'd point that out. So a quick call to action. I mentioned our Talos team. This link here, cisco.com/go/security report. We come out with an annual security report, usually at the top of the calendar year, and then we update it in a mid-year security report. It gives all the insight that we gather from all the telemetry. We conduct surveys and things like that. So we gather information both from real-world customers, but also all the telemetry data that we use to bake into our products. And then we share that insight periodically. We also blog and stuff like that. But the security report's a great place to get a better sense for some of those threats, right? What's actually occurring in the world. Our overall security, if you go to cisco.com/go/security, kind of takes you through the various products and things that I did a very quick job of just introducing products and services and so forth. But to learn more about the framework, I encourage you to do that too. It's literally like a 40-page document, and like I said, it's you can take it open and read it and understand it within just a one read. Right? 40-page document is from NIST perspective is, wow, only 40 pages? This thing's not 400 pages? But if you go to nist.gov/cyberframework, and they also have more information like the newsletter and other types of updates. So like the newsletter from July is where I learned more about how Texas is actually starting to adopt this and so forth. So I thought I'd share with you that. Obviously, stop by our Cisco booth. Everything that I just described here at a sort of a high level, we have a little handout to share with you. And certainly, we would love to continue the conversation with you guys. But I hope you leave this session with an understanding of the framework. Whether California decides to adopt it or not, who knows, right? But we think about cybersecurity in terms of best practices. Certainly, you do too. We would love to help, whatever framework we continue to stay with SAM or not, right? We'd love to be able to help. So stop by, talk with us. I'd love to get your feedback, like I mentioned on this. And obviously, fill out the survey, as well. There's a survey on everyone's, chair. So I'd love to make sure that we can get the feedback from that session. With that, I thought I'd stop and see what questions we have. I know that I didn't do that great a job of explaining this, so. There's a question in the back. Yeah. So the question was, from an industry or a private sector perspective, what would we recommend that, the state agencies, do to improve cybersecurity? I think one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about this framework is because it can really help us help you. The more standard way that we think and talk about cybersecurity. So for me to go and understand the state administrative manual, and I got to tear that apart, and if Texas does something different than Alabama and Mississippi, you can kind of see that if we all talk about cybersecurity in a consistent way, we in industry can do a better job of helping to solve the problems. All right, so I put that out there. The other thing that I think about is if we follow frameworks like this, we can do a better job of people who, we're all going to suffer attrition. So we bring somebody in who worked at a different state agency, but we're all following the same best practices. We're not going to have to now sit them down in front of a 77-page state administrative manual. Here, figure this out. We're doing it differently than everybody else. So, I understand that we can't solve everything with standards and frameworks and things like that, but I think the closer that we can all get to using that same kind of structure, and what better way, to use all the best practices that come out of the National Institute of Standards and Technology to use as a starting point. All right, so I don't know if that answered the question, but that's certainly from our perspective. Yep. Yeah. So what she was saying is that California is already in this shop, and certainly, right? When I looked through this SAM 5300 and I saw that the state had painstakingly mapped everything to NIST 853, I'm like, wow, that's had to have taken months to sit down and do. Like, wow, that's got the load on the state to do that. And I think that's why I put the slide up earlier about the Brookings Institution that suggested that the more we can do to do a consistent way across all the states and things is an element of best practices, at least from their perspective as well. Other question over here?
Yeah, some of us are looking at other frameworks.
Yeah. Sure.
How do you correlate with asset management and identity access management, all the different processes that are in there with what is in this best practice?
Yeah. So the question was about, there's all kinds of different frameworks out there, including the IT Infrastructure Library, or ITIL, right? And ITIL goes way deeper than cybersecurity. It goes into things like service management and all that other stuff, right? So I think what we're saying here is that the purpose of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework is to take cybersecurity risk management and plug it into whatever you're already doing. So if you're using the IT Infrastructure Library, there's a good chance and I've been a while since I've looked at it, right? Because then plus that's gone through a pile of revisions and things like that. But it's probably not the preeminent source for cybersecurity risk management information. So if we could take the framework and its best practices, apply it to whatever framework we're already using, then I think that's a win-win. And that's why I'm saying, that's why they don't put profile templates out there. They don't want to pen you into a way of thinking. They want you to use the framework in the context of what you're already doing for risk management. But now let's bring that cybersecurity risk management to the table and align it all together. Does that answer the question there? Okay. Other question here?
The federal government
Yeah, you know, it's funny. Even the Department of Commerce now themselves, right? NIST is part of them. They're looking at adopting the cybersecurity framework themselves as well. Yeah, and that's why I'm saying, like, I encourage everyone to continue looking at the NIST newsletter, so they, constantly post an update. And NIST is, anything that's new. It's only been out for about 2 years. They have an outreach team. They're trying to get everybody to, to understand it, right? So not only across the federal government, but I'm going to speak again with the Naval Facilities Engineering Command and get them up to speed on what the framework is all about, because they're left trying to adopt the risk management framework, which is obviously that heavier thing. So if I can help them figure out the stuff that's going to keep their cybersecurity plane in the sky, then I think that's a win for all. Other questions? There's a question right here.
I appreciate this presentation, and we know that Cisco really originally came from connectivity and routing and throughput, and now you're merging into the framework. And I haven't read your report, apologize, but do you also have a component of, in that common language that we're trying to give to the executives on why it's important, have you cost-benefit analysis? Do you have that kind of information so that people can really understand what the means I make this expenditure? Because I think that's one of the messages where we really fall short in that protected area is we don't have a good cost-benefit analysis.
Okay, so I'm going to paraphrase the question very quickly, but I think you were saying is that, does Cisco have any data around cost-benefit analysis against the, the framework? And I think the one thing I just want to, point out there in terms of answering the question is that this is why I want to make you aware of things like our advisory services, right? So we have the experts who not only understand this stuff, but other frameworks as well. I'm certainly not here. But I think the conversation needs to be sat down individually for every agency. And that's what the framework is all about. It's about you making your own risk-based decision against this. And sometimes you need help, sometimes you don't, right? But then you can figure out where that cost-benefit analysis is, right? When I say that these two things are putting us at an unacceptably high risk and we need to address them, then I think the next step is to figure out what is the cost, what is the benefit to improving that? And do I want to go from tier 1 to tier 2, and is that okay? Or do I want to go to tier 1 to tier 4, and obviously probably incur additional expenses in order to get there, right? Only you can make that decision on your own. And that's like I said, that's sort of the power of the framework. I think we're out of time, but I'm certainly around to answer additional questions. I want to thank all of you. I hope you found the session worthwhile. Again, fill out the survey and so forth. Our booth is right around the corner. Again, my name is Steve Caimi. Thank you guys so much for coming. I appreciate it.